The next thing we're going to learn about is what it was like to be a student in the Middle Ages. Hey, does this picture look familiar? Seen me parading up and down with one of those maces? Yeah, no, I don't think so. But actually, there are a lot of things about the medieval university that are familiar to us today. Um, Indeed, the fact that we are, in theory, at a university is from the Middle Ages. In fact, what we're going through right now would actually be a lot more comprehensible to a medieval university student than us today, because to a medieval university student, the place didn't matter. It was the people made the university. So the fact that we're spread all over the place, working on this independently. Sorry guys, a train is about to go past and is going to blast its horn. Because I live by the train line, and if it's not a train coming past with a horn, it's a cat trying to attack my microphone. But medieval students considered... Yeah, there we go. Medieval students considered themselves the most important part. It was them and the professors, and they called their professors masters in the Middle Ages, that made a university. The place was really secondary to them. So to them, the fact that we're hundreds of miles apart even would be a lot less important to them than it is to us today. So we can take heart that that is the origin of the university. The people made it, not the place. The fact that they created universities in the Middle Ages really shows what a big shift there was in terms of intellectual developments and learning in general in the time period. If we go back again to the early Middle Ages, those are monks who were learning to read and write and be artists. Or if it wasn't a monk, then it was a priest. In the early Middle Ages, most places of education were in the monasteries, maybe the palace schools where Charlemagne and the other Carolingians would educate clever men to work for them. But from the late 11th century, there was a big shift. More places to learn than ever before. Urban cathedral schools in Northern Europe, and in Italy they started founding municipal schools, town schools. Why is this? Well, this is actually going hand in hand with the process of urbanisation. That is, more and more people leaving the countryside or the rural areas to live in the cities. The kind of people we find in medieval cities are unlike what we would find in the countryside. People in medieval cities were merchants, artisans, and by artisans I mean these people who are building cathedrals or making books, and they wanted a different life for their kids. They didn't want them to become priests necessarily. Their kids, because feudalism, weren't going to become lords, but these people are wealthy and they want their kids to have careers. They don't want them to be in holy orders, but if they want to have a kid who's going to be a merchant, it's going to be better for business if they're able to talk about intelligent things, if they're numerate, literate. And then, of course, at the same time, we've got the start of the nation state as we know it. Countries like France, England, Spain, coming together in a way that we're quite familiar with today. What do governments need? Well, they need clever people to help run them. Governments still do today. Today in governments, there are still a huge amount of people who work for the government. And in the Middle Ages, the kings needed smart people to run their countries and their estates for them. And those are the jobs that the urban elites wanted for their children. And so they created a new demand for education. And so we have the beginnings of our universities. They wanted their kids to be, this technical term at the end here, bureaucrats, clerks, writers, go into working for the king. It's also part of a bigger trend towards literacy. Around the year 1000, very few lay people were literate. And lay people means people who weren't in the church. By 1300, anybody who wanted more than a labouring job needed to know how to read, at least. Education grew with both not just the power of kings and the rise of the nation state, but also with the power of the Pope. He needed clever guys to work for him as well. So these schools, both in Northern Europe and Southern Europe, even though they're different types, they had students who wanted knowledge and practical skills, that they could be both well educated for the benefit of knowledge, but also for their careers. And I'm sure that's a sentiment that's very familiar to you. Indeed, what they would study would be quite familiar to you, because they studied the liberal arts. They had to do a broad education the way you do today. So the students in the Middle Ages trained in the liberal arts, and once they had mastered the liberal arts, then they could go on to the specialised or advanced disciplines of medicine, the two types of law, because there was the civil law and there was the church law, called a canon law, and then medicine and theology, which of course we know is the same as philosophy. So advanced study was only possible in those disciplines. What most students went to university for, they did the liberal arts, got their degree, went and got themselves a job. Now, as I just said, medieval students would have been a lot more comfortable with what's happening now with COVID-19 than us. Well, I mean, as we're going to see next week, they're pretty used to pandemics in the Middle Ages anyway, but to them, it's the people that were most important. The way that the universities came about, indeed, even the term university comes from the Latin, universitas, and that is another word for the guild. So we saw in an earlier video how the mystery play was not a whodunit, it was a guild play. Universitas, another word for a guild. And the reason that university is the term that we use is because these were a guild of students or a guild of masters. The people maketh the university. They had no fixed campus, they had no fixed buildings at the very beginning. The only person who could declare a place as having a university was the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor. And this was something that gave its graduates the right to teach anywhere. So it was the people, it wasn't the place. They could get their heads around what we're going through today. The other thing they would have had in common to make it a university was they needed to have one of these four higher faculties, they called them. So medicine, canon law, civil law, or theology. Theology was the smallest, but the most prestigious. Now, while most of the students going into the university did not want to become a priest, much like you guys today, it was still coming out of an earlier religious tradition, so theology was still very important within the curriculum. So they had these 7 liberal arts to do. Those are the courses they would have taken as an undergraduate. They can be split within 2. The first is the trivium, and these are the literary ones. And the second is the quadrivium, and these are the scientific and mathematical ones. So the next bullet point explains what these 7 liberal arts were. So for the trivium, these are the ones you would start with. So you would do Latin grammar, because obviously Latin is the language of the elite. And you actually might have even done a bit of this before you got to university. Rhetoric was the next most important thing, and a lot of schools, like monastery schools, the earlier schools, would have stopped here. Logic was the third, usually studied as what we call dialectic. And we met this earlier already in another video when we talked about Peter Abelard. This is how to take 2 opposing arguments and find the common ground between them. They would have studied this as part of their degree. Logic required comparison of different sources. So those 3, grammar, rhetoric and logic, and rhetoric being the science of argument, made up the trivium. Yeah, they were pumping out lawyers even back then. The quadrivium, the science and the mathematics, were the next 4. Arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. And you're going, music, what? But I'll explain. So arithmetic was the most important part of the quadrivium. By the way, tri, you can't remember which way around, tri, 3. Quad is Latin for 4. So the trivium means the literary 3, and the quadrivium means the science and mathematics 4. So arithmetic was the most important part. Most of the scientific knowledge in the Middle Ages would have come from practical experience rather than school. So if you're building a cathedral, for example, you wouldn't have gone to university necessarily to learn how to do that. But certainly you would have needed to have known arithmetic and geometry to do that, but you could have been taught that through your apprenticeship. So geometry had a very practical side to it as well. So did music. So it wasn't the way we study music today, which is about performance mainly. It was music theory. And it was music production, such as, what would have been the certain length of string to get a certain note, not performance. Or they would have been concerned with, vaulting, what will get the best acoustics. Astronomy, again, reflects the influence of the church. And we might not think that, but think about how we find different religious calendar dates. Everybody thinks, oh, it's for navigation. That's a little bit of it. But mainly it was because, man, you should Google the calculation for Easter sometime. There were serious fights in the Middle Ages, early in the Middle Ages, about how to calculate Easter correctly. That is some head-wrecking mathematics right there. So astronomy was vitally important because they needed to know how to do this accurately to get the right dates for major religious feasts in their calendar. Where were they studying? Well, there's more and more of these universities cropping up. 1200, there's only 4. Two in the north and 2 in the south. There's Paris and Oxford in the north, and Bologna and Salerno in the south. And Bologna and Salerno are both in Italy. And my cat is on top of my notes, and he's too fat to jump down. You want to jump? Okay, he's jumped. You heard a thud, that was him. So it has 4 recognised universities. Cambridge is actually founded in 1209. I've got the wrong date on this map. It's the other one in England, but you can see it's quite condensed in certain places more than others. So the movement spreads quite slowly in some places and then much quicker in others, like Italy, which is quite an urban place. This means that by 1300, there's about 20 universities across Europe. By 1500, there's about 79 of them. So, like the printing press, these are spreading throughout Europe. Let's look at these original 4 in a little bit more detail, though. Let's start off with Salerno. That's probably the least known one and yet the most interesting one. Salerno is in the south of Italy. It would have been known in the Middle Ages as being the place to go to medical school. So if you wanted to be a doctor, and today you might be like, oh, I really want to go to Harvard Medical School. Well, if you were a medieval person, you'd want to go to the medical school at the University of Salerno. It was known from the 10th century. It became a university officially in the 13th. The reason why Salerno was the place to go was because of its geographical location in the south of Italy. Remember what we said about Italy in earlier classes? Hot mess. Well, this is great for intellectual pursuits because you've got all these different cultures coming together, bringing together their knowledge and their ideas and merging it into a big melting pot and creating something new. So if you went to the University of Salerno, you would have learned the medical traditions from the West. You would have learned the medical traditions from the Byzantine Empire because they had also conquered Italy at one point. The Islamic world, same reason. But you also would have learned from the ancient Greeks, Galen being the most famous. He's the one who came up with the theory of the humours. So in general, medicine back at this time period would have been a mix of superstition, common sense, observation. In the medical textbooks, they did provide very good advice and herbal remedies, because remember, they didn't have chemicals at the time, so all their drugs needed to have been made out of plants, mainly. Some of these might have worked. They did make huge intellectual progress in terms of medicine in the Middle Ages, because they combined these different traditions and figure out what worked best. And to this, they added botany and anatomy. Yeah, they did study anatomy in the Middle Ages. So Salerno, it laid the foundation for modern day medicine. On the other hand, up in the north of Italy, Bologna was where you would go to law school. That's where you really want to go. And there were a number of top law schools in Europe. Again, because Bologna was in Italy, and Italy was a hot mess, they had the benefit of learning all these loads of different legal traditions. They studied in particular the Corpus Juris Civilis that was created by the Emperor Justinian. If that name is familiar to you, we did talk about him. He's the most famous Byzantine emperor. They studied Roman law as well. And this was new to them. They combined Roman and Byzantine laws with the Germanic customary laws, which we learned all about, Vergald. Remember the guy with the red hot bar of iron? Yep, they would have learned about that and combined it with Roman law. What they were trying to do was use their powers of logic and scholastic theory to make law more rational in this time period. So again, the foundations of modern day legal systems created in these universities. There were other great law schools around Europe, though. Montpellier, Orléans, Paris in France. Oxford in England was also very well known for its law school. Now, students always love hearing about the University of Bologna because they had their own system of doing things, and the place was run by the students. As I said, the word university comes from universitas, and that's another word for guild. So it was about the people. And it could either be that a bunch of students get together to form a guild to look after their education, or a bunch of masters, that's what they called their professors, would get together and do the same thing. And in Bologna, it was a student guild. The students got together and they dictated they wanted a university, and they went around and hired the professors, hired the masters. Because of the fact that the students, this was the origins, students love hearing about the life of students in Bologna and go, oh, I wish it was like that now, because the students ruled the roost. The masters, the professors of Bologna, had a very strict life. If they wanted to leave the university, they had to post bail to students. They got fined if they fell behind in their lectures, or if they failed to cover the course the right way. The students had a lot of control. I don't know what they would have done in times of quarantine like what we're in now. I presume the masters would have been given a bit of an excuse then, because the students' interest at heart. But students are like, oh, gosh, I wish it was like that now. Well, let me tell you, we don't follow the northern tradition of having a masters guild either nowadays. Today, it's the administrators guild. I think, well, okay, I'll keep my opinions to myself. Paris. Paris is the most famous of the northern universities. And the most famous part of it is this beautiful, what type of cathedral is that? Look at those flying buttresses. That's a Gothic cathedral. It's the oldest northern university. And Paris really was about the people and not the places. They taught at lots of places scattered around the city. The most important was the cathedral school at Notre Dame, which housed their world-class theology department. Who was there? Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard. So the big names, this is where they were housed. There were lots of fights between the people who ran the cathedral and the theology professors and the students. Oxford is the last of these four universities. Oxford was founded because, oh no, sorry, wrong way around. I think I should know better, being an alum of Cambridge, but Cambridge just misses out on that 1200 date because it was founded by professors and students fleeing from Oxford in the aftermath of a murder. And in Oxford, a student had murdered a woman, and then when he, I don't know, I think it was an accidental death, when he murdered her, he ran away anyway, and they couldn't find him. So because they couldn't find the culprit, they hung his roommate instead. Yeah. You're all now thinking, hell no, I wouldn't take the fall for my roommate. That roommate didn't want to either. And they hung him, and the students and professors walked out in protest and said, right, we're leaving the town. We're going to form our own university. You don't respect us. We're off. And so they founded Cambridge. So what was life like for these students then? Well, they probably were a bit younger than you. They might have started when they were about 15 years old. Like you, they'll have studied under different masters, but they would have had a senior master, like their advisor, to help them. Students apparently deputised one student to take notes, and then they would all have gone to the bar to memorise it together over a nice drink. I'm sure that does not sound remotely familiar to any of you, definitely not in this time of social distancing. But of course, think about what materials would they have had, okay? Think about it. What do you use today to take your notes? You're on a computer with your smartphone, your pens, your pencils, your notebooks. And then think about what medieval students had. They don't even have paper. They got animal skin. Yeah, vellum, if they were lucky. Or maybe a wax tablet to write on. So that's why they had to share materials. And you think your textbooks are expensive today? Can you imagine how much it would cost to buy your textbook if somebody who also had a university education needed to make it for you by hand, every single word? Yeah, materials were really expensive for students. So I really don't blame them for going to the bar afterwards to try and memorise them together. Although alcohol seems kind of counterintuitive to that. After 4 or 5 years, the students took exams, and he would have then got his bachelor's degree. I say his deliberately because it was only for boys. They then could have spent another 2 years getting their master's degree, and this would have given them the right to be a teacher at universities. So to be a master, you had to attend and contribute to weekly disputations. And this was the method, like their version of lectures or seminars was called the disputation. And their exams, they would need to have passed exams. They would have been examined just like us today, make sure they were ready for their qualification and had earned it. But you guessed it, they don't really have the materials. So they would have had to have done it orally, an oral exam. Can you imagine? Yeah, I give you a midterm, I'm going to give you a final, you're going to be stressed about that. But can you imagine, not just if I gave you one test at the end of the semester, but one test at the end of your degree? Yeah, suddenly all the exams we make you do and all the busy work doesn't seem so bad. It's better than the alternative. After he passed his bachelor, he became master. Yeah, it's the merging of the two. No, it's not. It's joking. Don't repeat that to me. He became a Master of Arts if he passed his master's degree. And at this option, he could have continued on to become a doctorate, or he could have taught or become a clerk. Most of them did not, though. 80 to 90% of students just got their bachelor's degree. It's pretty similar figures to today, actually. Because another 6 to 8 years were needed for a doctorate in law. If you wanted to do your doctorate in theology, and you would have done that if you wanted to be a real mover and shaker in the church, 12 to 15 years, 35 years old was the minimum age that you could get your doctorate in theology. This usually leads to interesting conversation with students. It's not that, oh my God, they would have got their degree and then died. When we're talking about life expectancy, in the Middle Ages, yeah, it was like a 50-50 chance that you would have got out of childhood. But if you got out of childhood, you would have lived until, even today, what we would consider old middle age or even old age. If you were a woman, the greatest risk was childbirth, and if you're a man, warfare. And if you were a student, you probably weren't going to go to war. So as long as you came out of childhood okay, chances are you would have lived almost as long as we did today. It's just that so many people died when they were young that it brings the average life expectancy down. Because emphasis was on memory, right? They don't have the materials we have today. They're really not very creative in their learning in the Middle Ages. They had to learn rote memorization, which probably sucked for them. In terms of their finances, most of them were supported by their parents. Though by the late 13th century, they were getting sponsored by local town governments and who were giving them stipends. In return, they'd have to come and work for the city government after finishing their studies. There were also benefactors who kind of worked like scholarships. A lot of the time, what they would have done was subsidise or form communal housing. So basically, like your dorms today would have been paid for by a benefactor for you. To save time and money, some of the lecturers would have just lived there too. Have classes there, save you trapsing across a big city. And that's how we end up with universities being places. Laziness. Students of theology and canon law, that's church law, they also tended to support themselves by taking vacant church livings, and therefore the peasants would have given them the tithes to support their education. So for a needy student, well, a good income, but sucks if you were the parishioner because you'd be giving all your money over to somebody who never would have come anywhere near you. Students were very violent in the Middle Ages. They rioted repeatedly. That murder case in Oxford, it wasn't a shock that a student had murdered someone. That sadly was not terribly uncommon in the Middle Ages. The problem was that his roommate got hung for it. But riots, student riots, were an eternal problem in the Middle Ages, and students and masters were forbidden from carrying weapons. There's lots of legal cases about students stabbing people and professors stabbing other professors. They really annoyed the people who lived in the towns around them because students because they were scholars, they had the semi-priest status, which meant that if they committed a crime, they were not tried within the civil courts. Instead, they were taken to the church court. And the church court was notoriously easygoing. They would just get a slap on the wrist. So this meant that they could riot and stab people and not really get punished for it. And this made all the townspeople really, really, really mad. Part of the reason why they had to be banned from taking weapons into class with them is because they had a pretty confrontational way of being taught, the disputation. In Latin, the disputatio. So in this system, in this picture here, you can see the lecturer's up high, so his voice will carry better, and he is reading out loud from a book, and there's some students there trying to remember. There's at least one who's having a nap, and there's a couple having a chat, and then there's others taking notes and reading along. The rich kids, obviously. So the lecturer is going to read out the relevant passages, and then the students would debate opposing views, the yes and the no, and they would reach a compromise conclusion somehow. So that's this way of logic, right? So the disputatio, there were two very common forms. Number one, the obligatio. And in this, a respondent defended a claim against an opponent, and the aim of the game was to force the respondent into contradicting themselves by continuously advancing other statements. And they had to sort of battle of verbal wits. The other form was the quodlibet, literally a disputation about anything. So basically here, the master would settle difficult questions from the floor on any topic within his field. These were often, therefore, public confrontations, where a master would get together a gang of his students and they would face off against another master and their students. So kind of like if I got all you guys together and then I went and found another history professor and their students and we had like this verbal battle going down, like, you know, some breakdancing contest, only you'd step forward and try and get them to contradict themselves and trip them up with your wordsmithery. And that is how they weren't allowed their weapons, because sometimes they would get so pet up by this debate format, which is how they learned, that they'd end up stabbing each other. And they weren't allowed to do that. That did not mean you wanted to stab someone. I've actually tried disputations numerous times in class. And unfortunately, with us being online, it's not really going to work. But actually, it does work really well as a way to get you to remember things. It really does help things stick in your mind. So it actually does work very well as a teaching method. Okay, this is the last video. The last thing for you to do is to fill out the next slide about similarities and differences. And then that is you for this week. Congratulations, as long as you've worked your way through the Nearpod and you have completed the architecture summary.